Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We are returning to Book 5, where we're on the penultimate chapter, because Book 5 has basically 11 chapters, and today we're looking at chapter 10. We're wrapping up the discussion of justice and the concern with equity, so we're going to deal with the question of that. Today's topic is the question of the equity and the equitable, right? So let's go look at it. Okay, let's start. Um, what concerns equity and the equitable? Okay, how equity stands in relation to justice, and the equitable in relation to the just, the equitable person in relation to the just person, right, is the next thing to speak of. So therefore, that's the whole point. Now, he says the reading of the manuscript, the ancient tradition translation, an ancient translation, however, suggests an original text that would have read, hence, this missing this hence this the good is something human, right? So therefore that okay, that the good is something human. That this was Burnett and others prefer this amended version, since the text as it stands has no expressed or even implied subject. Okay, this is the problem. This is the sentence here is kind of a problem in that sense. That the good is something human. This, hence this, and given that the question of justice is there, right? This is the previous chapter right up here, right? On account of this sentence here, how it ends is kind of weird. The next sentence, equitable, right? Equitable. What is concerning equity here is this is epicity, epia, kia, okay, kia. So epi, a kia, okay, and the equity here is a problem because sometimes they will say equity, but then epicity also means decency. Okay, so in one level, this word has two dimensions. Like all Greek words, the problem with when we're translating a text like Aristotle or the ancient Greeks, the Greek often has multiple meanings of the word. Okay, this is like archon, arche, and archon has kind of not only beginning point but also rule, right? Or metobae means not only it means change, but also we use it in terms to like revolution, right? Um, here, epikeia, equity also means decency, right? And he will translate it decency, the equitable. This idea is fair, balanced. Okay, this is also tied with equal. So the question is equity, which is the verb, the activity, right, and the equitable, the person being who engages in, who has the character of being equitable, like the akin to justice, the activity, and the just, the person who exercises the characteristic of justice, right? This is kind of how we should understand what's this theme here in that sense, right? So let's go continue from the next sentence. For they appeared to those who examined them to be neither simply the same thing nor each in the same genus. Okay? So equal justice, in other words, equity and justice, they at one level, and the just and the equitable are, he says, they don't, when you look at it closely, they neither simply when you examine them, neither are simply the same thing, and nor each are in a different genus. They're kind of like they're not. They don't look the same, but they seem. Okay, let's read that line. To be neither simply the same thing, nor in a different genus. In other words, they're not completely different, but they're not completely the same either, right? And sometimes we praise what is equitable and this sort of man, such that when we bestow praise also on other things, we use the term equitable in place of the good. So, equitable in place of the good, thus making it clear that what is more equitable is better. So, therefore, ironically, when we praise somebody, we don't call them good. We call them. In other words, the idea is that equitable is being better than just good. The problem. Remember, what does good mean? Good means maybe at one level what is advantageous. Okay, what is what is beneficial and advantageous. See, the good can have different levels. There's the good, and remember, there's this whole idea of what is good in particular things versus what is good simply, right? This is the ladder of from the particular to the general and universal, right? This is the problem with the good. The good has different levels, like truth. Okay, truth has different levels, as we remember. That therefore the good here in this sense, well, the equitable has a very specific meaning. There's a kind of balance or fairness to it, so, right? This is why at one level the equitable is better than the good in that sense, right? And this is what he says. We bestow the term, and we tend to praise also on other things, right? When we use the term equitable in place of good, right? Making it clear that what is more equitable is better. But sometimes it appears strange to those who follow up on the argument. If the equitable is something praiseworthy, despite it being other than the just, right? That's the problem. In other words, the equitable and the just are not the same thing, but it's still praiseworthy. Okay, so therefore it's kind of strange. It appears strange to follow the argument that if the equitable is something praiseworthy, despite it differs from the just. For if they are different, either the just is not a spudaios, a serious thing, or the equitable itself is not just, right? Or if both are serious, they are the same thing. So this is the problem. It's what is meant here. Now, this at 44, note 44, this leads to the reading of one manuscript. There's different manuscripts of the Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics. Okay, and therefore there's a disagreement about this. This is why there's a note here. This is why the text is trying to show the different, what they put here, they chose one manuscript, but they want to be honest and say, okay, another manuscript says this, right? The reading of one manuscript, either the equitable is not a serious thing or it is not just if they are different. So that's another reading of it. This is that, in other words, if the just is not a serious thing, or if the equitable is itself not just, right? Or, in other words, that's one reading. The other reading is either the equitable is not a serious thing, or it is not just if they are different, right? This is the question. So the question is, or if if both are serious, then they must be the same thing. The argument, or they are the same thing, right? That's kind of the question, the perplexity, right? That's what he says. The perplexity concerning what is equitable then arises for pretty much these reasons. So therefore, in other words, the argument is this, and actually this is the big problem. This is one of the things: equity and equality, the just and the equitable. Seems to be two different things. We had the discussion of the just, the three dimensions of justice, right? That is that he talked about earlier through the text. Now, regarding the equitable, there is this idea that there is something different about it. But to what degree is there something? Is there really a difference? Is this difference? He says, in one way they appear different, and another way they're not. They're of the same species. The genus, gene. The genus means the same class of things. In other words, the just and the equitable are kind of in the same class, but they're at another level. They differ from each other. Why is this? And he says, and this perplexity: are they really the same thing? In other words, as he says here, this earlier line, right? Are they the same thing, or are they not the same thing? Is one better? Is the equitable not just? And in other words, is the equitable not tied? Has no connection with justice? But he doesn't. He thinks they're the same class, right? If they're different, is the just not serious? Or is the equitable not serious? Or if both are serious, they must be true, right? If one is not serious, but if it is serious, then is it not just? But if they're both just and serious, then they must be the same thing, right? That's the whole perplexity. This is the perplexity. But for all such considerations, are in a certain way correct and do not stand in any opposition to them. So therefore, he says that all these problems, they're all it's a perplexity, yes, and they're all correct in some way. Okay? That is why the perplexity is there. They do not stand in any opposition to one another. For the equitable, though it is better than the just in a certain sense, is just. And it is not because it belongs to a different class of things that it is better than the just. So it's not, in other words, it seems to be better than the mere just. Okay. The equitable seems to be better than the mere just. But that doesn't make it a different class. It is it is still a form of justice in a sense. It is, in other words, it belong not because it belongs to a different class that it is better than the just. So it still remains within the realm of the class of the just. Therefore, the just and the equitable are in a. Let's do this here. For the in other words, there it is. This is that line, line 10, right? Therefore, the just and the equitable are the same thing. And although both are serious, the equitable is superior. Okay, this is the equitable is something superior to mere justice. To mere justice. This is what produces the perplexity, because although the equitable is just, it is not what is just according to the law. So therefore, that's the problem. Now, this is the big thing. The what is just, usually the lawful. The lawful is what is, there's an element, again, we have to remember the difference between what is by nature and what is by a law, right? There is the just by nature and the just by law. Now, he is suggesting here, there's the implicit suggestion here, that what equity is, or equitable things are it is something akin to, not, in other words, the simply just is what is equitable by law, right? In other words, it is not not what is just according to law. So therefore, because though the equitable is just, the equitable seems not to be merely what the law says. It goes beyond the law in that sense. Therefore, does the equitable go? Does what is equitable? In other words, equitableness seems to be at the same level as natural right. What is just by nature? That's one interpretation of this, right? That, in other words, given that political justice, or what is the law, is right, is what is by nomos is it is a reflection or a part of what is by nature. The nature and what is by just nature is higher, and that what is just by law is kind of a embodiment, and maybe sometimes semi-perfect. It's only perfect with the best regime and the best political order, but that's the whole point. Right? The law, political justice, is only truly reflecting of what is by right justice, true justice, at the natural level, is only found in the best regime. Right? That's that whole line that Aristotle's point. But this leads us to this question here. This is what produces the perplexity, because although the equitable is just, it is not what is just according to law. The equitable is instead a correction of the legally just. So, in other words, the question of equity is kind of a correction of the law. And therefore, therefore, this is why I think this is equity is kind of a natural justice in a sense, right? It is the application of natural right, maybe in that sense, right? Or what is just by nature, right? The cause of this is that all law is general, but concerning some matters, it is not possible to speak correctly in general ways. So, okay, this is the interesting point. Now, law deals. This is the nature of a law. A law is always general. So even though a law is a reflection of the just, the nature of law is always going to be general, and therefore there might be a disconnect, right? So, in other words, this is where all of a sudden, okay, the regime, what is right by nature and just by nature, natural right, what is just by nature. This is true simply. The just and the just simply. Political law is always going to be political right is always going to be a reflection of that. Now, thus, equity is not necessarily natural justice in this regard. That it is still political in a sense. It's political, but it's different from law. It is not law. It corrects law, but it's not necessary. It is that, in other words, the equitable is that intermeeting place, because law is always going to be general. It's always going to talk about the nature of law is always going to appeal to a general thing. It appeals to everyone equally. It's going to always appeal. In other words, he says, law is general. But concerning some matters, it is not possible to speak correctly in a general way. In other words, there's the specific case in a specific instance. If you apply the general principle, it's not, something's wrong here. It's, in fact, you'll do something wrong. In other words, it's not going to be, there's going to be an error of justice. So the law might not, that this might, in other words, the law always speaks. This is the thing that Aristotle talks about, the difference between the decree and the law in Book 3, at the end of Book 3. This is the difference between the rule, why the rule of law is always going to be a problem, and why a decree, a decision by a ruler, can be more just in that sense. This is why the just man is better than the rule of law. And this is the famous dialogue with one of the logoi in book and the last part of politics, the famous discussion between the rule of law versus the Pambasileia, right? In Book 3, the last 3 chapters, last 4 chapters of Book 3. So therefore, this is what he's saying now. He brings this problem right here in the 4th book. Here is because the idea here is that law is always going to be specific and general, and therefore it will always talk in a general way. And some things you cannot, some specific problems, when you apply a general thing, it's not going to be just, okay? And this is equitable. Equity allows you to correct the law, he's saying here. In those cases, then, which it is necessary to speak generally, but it is not possible to do so correctly. The law takes what is for the law takes what is for the most part the case, but without being ignorant of the error involved in so doing. In other words, and the law is no less correct for all that. The error resides not in the law or in the lawgiver, but in the nature of the matter at hand. Okay, so in other words, the error is not. In other words, the injustice of this moment is not an error in the law or an error in the lawgiver. The problem here is a problem in the complexity of the issue at hand. So therefore, and the law would recognize this. The law itself recognizes that, well, maybe that's unjust. There is injustice here. That in this case, what the law requires, this complexity of this, and I need to do this way for this reason, right? He says that, in other words, without being ignorant of the error involved in so doing. And the law is no less correct for all that. The error resides not in the law or in the lawgiver, but in the nature of the matter at hand. For such is simply the stuff of which actions are made, praxis. In other words, see the problem of praxis. This is the difference between theoria, which things are always the same, always are. They always are. They are or none are. There's not. Whereas praxis is always the level of being and becoming, and actions is at the level of praxis. This is the word action, praxis, right? It is the situation where things come to be and pass away. That they can be other. They can be other than they are, and this complexity leads to a problem of where the law, what the law says is just in this matter in a general way. In the specific case is a problem. It's not perfect. It's imperfect because of the complexity of it, right? For such is simply the stuff of which actions are made. Whenever the law speaks generally, then, but what happens in a given case constitutes an exception to the general rule, then it is correct where the lawgiver omits something and erred by speaking unqualifiedly, to rectify that omission with what the lawgiver himself would have said if he had been present, and if he had known this case, what he would have legislated. Okay, this is very interesting. Now, see, this is the problem in, let's say, Schmitt. The Schmitt, the idea that what is legality is the general principle. But the problem with legality is the norm. And there's going to be exceptions, things that the norm does not apply with, right? The exceptional situation. That's what he's saying. Now, he says that when the law speaks generally, but what happens in a given case constitutes an exception to the general rule. Now, he says then it's correct where the lawgiver omits something and erred in speaking unqualifiedly to rectify that omission. In other words, he can rectify it. There can be rectification of the specific one. That, in other words, this is an exception. And that what dealing with equity allows you to do, basically, this is what he says here. And the lawgiver himself would have said if he had been present and if he had known the case, what he would have legislated. So the equity is the dealing with the exception. This is interesting. I think this is how you respond to Schmitt, the critics of Schmitt. In other words, the argument is, well, the exception is just a general will. No, it's equity. When in other words, the question of the rule of the exception, this is not merely the will. This is of the ruler imposing itself, external of law. This is the difference between what is lawful and equitable. It is still justice. See that? I think this is how Schmitt himself understood this. I think ultimately this is what Schmitt himself would understand, because remember his point about the nature of law, the distinction between law, what is lawful and what is decree, and how the modern mid 20th century legal thought, particularly Germanic continental European legal thought, blurs the distinction between what is a law and what is a decree, right? And this is a big problem in Roman law, right? The civil law model. There's this distinction of this, where in the common law, the difference between a law and the questions of equity was always acknowledged, right? The courts always addressed equity. That's not only what the law says, but in disputes of tort, and particularly in the tort law, there was always going to be, yes, the customs would apply, but when the custom did not, the law or the ruling did not apply, then the judge and the jury would decide the equitableness of it. Okay, I think this is what Aristotle was trying. I think this is how the tradition of law, different law, understood this, and how Schmitt himself, looking at the Germanic law, this civil law model, seeing this problem, and looking at the problem of what happens when you absolutize the norm, right? You absolutize the legislative norm as the norm, and that you forget about the exception. And therefore, it is to forget about equity. In other words, the modern political legal theory often conflates justice with equity, okay, and therefore conflates justice with what the law says. Whereas Aristotle understands that it's always because of the complexity of nature. See, that's what's interesting. See, once you understand it within this Aristotelian lens, what Schmitt is saying is not all that controversial or threatening to law or justice. See, if you understand that law is merely the embodiment of justice, and anything that deviates from law and the norm of law is unjust, which is kind of the modern way, right? This is the modern reductionist construction of just. Therefore, this leads us to a kind of a dilemma. We look at the Schmitt exception and say, "Oh my God, this is a threat to law and justice." Right? It is something outside the scope of justice. For Aristotle, no, it's equity. It's the correction of the law. It's a way For the law cannot, in this situation, the situation is an exception outside what the law can generally say, and the law would not lead to justice in this situation. The situation is exceptional from what the general principle is, and therefore it needs to be corrected. But it is still geared towards what is the just by equity. Okay, I think that is, and this is what he says. This is the idea, and actually, this is Schmidt would actually have no problem with this if the lawgiver had been present. The equitable would have been what would have legislated. Hence, equity is just and better than what is just in a certain sense. Not what is just unqualifiedly, but the error that arises through its being stated unqualifiedly. Now, this is how you can understand what Schmidt ultimately says is the distinction between the question of decision, right? The decision of the need for decision in terms of the exception is not an this is, I mean, okay, Schmidt himself does speak of arbitrary act, right? He thinks because he's using the Hobbesian will, he accepts the Hobbesian willing structures that the sovereign is willing. Okay, so therefore in one level, because he accepts the language of sovereignty and the language of the willing agent, he falls into a dilemma that the Aristotelian model would not fall into. Okay, this is what he says. It says, hence the just is better in what is more certain sense, not in what is just unqualifiedly, but the error that arises of being stated unqualifiedly, right? This is, in fact, the nature of the equitable. The nature of the equitable is a correction of the law in the respect in which it is deficient because of its being general. So equity is the question of the equitable. Equity and equitableness is the way to resolve the question of the what is how to deal with the exception of the norm, between the exception and the norm. The problem is in the Hobbesian frame post Hobbes, there's no easy solution to this. Because this decision action, it is still. I think this is the case. He would say it would be what the lawgiver would have decided at that moment in that situation. But this is understood an act of will, not an act of understanding, not the rational. In other words, it's the willing act of the legislature. This is how this would be understood, how Schmidt and the modern would understand it. But Aristotle would understand this. No, it's the decision. It is the legislature looking at that situation in that condition, looking at that case, looking and understanding what the just is in that exact, precise, specific case. Okay, let me go continue for this, right? For this is the cause also of the fact that all things are not in accord with the law. It is impossible to set down a law in some matters, so that one must have recourse to a specific decree instead. Right. This is the whole point. He says. Right. This is the problem. Is law can never be fully sufficient because there's going to be cases that the case is going to fall out the scope of the law, and that therefore a decree will be needed for it to address it. And this is something he made. That is the big argument in Book 3 at the last part of discussion of the law versus the Pambasileia, the wise or the perfectly the Pambasileia, the universal king, or the king, the king over all king, right? Who is exercising wisdom, right? That he is exercising the idea of political wisdom, knowing what is right. So therefore, law is always kind of an inferior thing at that moment to knowing what the law, because the law is always a product of a lawgiver. Well, the law, but the rule of law presumes that the lawgiver here, but law is always going to be general, and there's going to be cases where you can't do it, and that's why you have you have the need for decrees. And who makes the decrees? Well, it should not necessarily be the lawgiver. It will be the ones enforcing the law, the ones who are usually the magistrates. The magistrates. Now, remember, in English tradition, the judges are magistrates. The judges are the magistrates that deal with it. So, therefore, in the common law, the judge addresses what is equitable. But that's one way. But also parliamentarians, the lawgiver itself, who can actually do things. But the problem is the nature of lawgivers is always producing acts of legislation. And that's the blurring moment, that some acts of legislation are particularized, right? They don't like that. They would rather give it to the executive. The executive agent or the magistrate should deal with the specific case, and they should apply the law. But the question then becomes what happens if the specific case and what is right, the law does not provide what is right. Now, the rule in Locke would have been prerogative, right? The rule of prerogative. But the solution, by one level, would be to let the judges decide. Right? This is the post Montesquieuan, the idea of the judges, the magistrate who deals with the equitable. That's even Aristotle's discussion at the end of Book 4. Right? This is why the adjudicative offices that are explicitly addressed. These are the offices that are, Book 4, the last chapter of Book 4. He deals with the offices that deal with adjudication, which deals with the questions of justice and equity, right? And that is the point. I think this is why Aristotle still matters in a great degree. So let us continue what this says. For this is the cause of the fact that all things are not in accord with law. It is impossible to set down laws in some matters, so that one must have recourse to specific decree instead. For the rule or measure of something indeterminate is indeterminate too, right? In other words, the rule or a measure of something that's indeterminate will also be indeterminate, just as the case with the lead rule used in the houses of Lesbos, right? The lead, the lead rule changes. The lead or lead rule changes in relation to the shape of the stone, and does not say the same. So too, the specific decree changes in relation to the matter at hand. So this is his defense of decree. Decree is not a general law. It changes. A decree always addresses the matter at hand, right? And that's why, and therefore, the question of a decree, a specific ruling of a decree, is and remember, that's what a judge does not make law; he makes a ruling, and the ruling is a decree in the sense in the Anglo-American law model. And actually, even in the civil law model, the law is what guides the judge in the civil law model, and the laws here, and thus is guided by what the law. He can't act outside of a law, right? Where the English court judge can, because there's not only what is the law, but there's also he's guided also by his rights. Some judges are bound only by law, but then there's other courts that are courts of equity, right? And the question of what is a court of equity versus a court of law. Usually, civil law courts are more courts of equity, whereas criminal laws are more courts of law, right? So therefore, this is the connection here. And the idea of Lesbos, this is why some scholars have suggested Aristotle refers here to a flexible piece of lead that was used in fitting of polygonal stones together in the Cyclopean building, such as Tyrrhene. This is what Burnet says. But Stewart suggests, and Burnet concludes, uh, um, um, that Aristotle has in mind a certain molding typical of Lesbos, which was undulating and not simply hollow like that of the Dorian. So in other words, and was shaped to the surface of one rock and then used to determine stones that would best match it. So in other words, it's not a rule that is not flexible. Some people say it's a bending rule, but no, he says no. It's a way of measuring that understands the matter. Now, again, this is what I would suggest. Peirce, the pragmatist, used when he came up with his model of mapping the sea. came up with a new model of this, understanding this point, that sometimes a measure has to be flexible, and therefore the question here is that indeterminate things, if you put a determinate thing on an indeterminate thing, it's going to be error. So to measure, you need in other words, a rule for something indeterminate in itself must have a flexibility and determination up here. So let's turn up to the next section, this the last paragraph here, and he goes, what the equitable is then, that it is both just and better than the just in a certain sense is clear. So therefore, this is this idea, right? We clarify, in other words, that it deals with the specific case, and it rectifies the error of what law is, right? It is manifest from this also who the equitable person is. He who is disposed to choose and to do these sorts of things, and is not exacting to the fault about justice, but is instead disposed to take less for himself, even though he has the law on his side, is the equitable. In other words, this is interesting. The equitable person is, the law says I can get this, but if I push that, maybe I'm not being just. You sense that something's wrong here. The law says I can take that away from you. The equitable person says, well, maybe I should. Okay? In other words, it is meant, the equitable person is he who is disposed to do and to choose and to do these sorts of things. In other words, to balance and correct justice. The law says I can do this, but it doesn't. This seems unjust. In this particular case, to do that doesn't seem fair. It doesn't look right. It's an error. It's not true. It's not correct. In other words, it's not that it doesn't feel right. It isn't right. What would be, this is because why that case is this case, what is right does not follow from what, because it's an exception. This case is not like that. There is a difference between what the norm is and what the law is designed to produce and what this case is. There's a distortion between the particular and the general. And that this distortion then, to do what the general does here, what the law requires, would be false or incorrect, hence unjust. Therefore, to do what is just here, you must kind of correct the law, right? And this is what he says here, right? And therefore, even though he has the law on his side, he will take less for himself. Okay, that's even more interesting. Less than, not more. Not, I'm going to take more. No, it's. I am. In other words, the just says I can have that, but instead of taking what the law says, I take little less. I take less because this is what seems correct, seems true, seems the correct answer to the problem. What is the right thing to do here? And this is the characteristic of equity, it being a certain sort of justice and not some other characteristic. So equity is a form of justice, but it's the form of justice that deals with the particular. Where justice in the legal sense, what is just by law, is this general sense. And therefore, when you deal with, this is interesting. The question here is that then when one deals with decrees, the question should be equity, not justice, not what the law says. Decrees should follow what the law says. But hence the spirit of the law. That's the whole. In other words, the spirit of the law is what justice is. The law aims at what is just. Okay. The problem here, the law in this case, if we obey it, this case is exception to what is normal. The law says what generally is and what in the normal case would be just. But in this case, this deviates from the norm, and because it deviates from the norm, to impose the norm, what the rule of the norm is here would be unjust. and this is why it is still a form of justice, but it's a form of justice that understands the reaction to the particularities and complexities of human praxis, the level of praxis. So let's stop here. We're at the end of the chapter. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down below. If you like it, hit the like button. Hit the like button, please. It helps the algorithm. It really does it. If you know friends who want to share it with friends, so please share it with friends. Share it far and wide. If you know someone who, if you're not subscribed, and if you know people who might be interested, encourage them to subscribe. So if you're not subscribed, please subscribe, because again, the more people subscribe, the channel gets it. Again, it helps the algorithm. If you know people who are interested, encourage them to come to look at the chat, look at what we're doing here, and maybe have them subscribe. Now, if you didn't like it, I think I did something wrong, of course you can hit the thumbs down, but then say why in the comments so everyone can learn. Okay. If you want to follow me on social media, my social media links below. If you want to know more about my scholarship and my research and things as me as a scholar, you can do so through the academic social medias below the social media links. Another way, if you want to help me to do what I do, in this sense, you can contribute through Subscribe to our Patreon, or you could buy one of my books that I list below, that I publish, that's published and available. And you can do so through either your local bookstore, request a bookstore to be ordering it, because you give them the bibliography, they'll be able to find it. Or you can order it through an online bookstore like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or anything else like that. I'll give you freedom and choice. I'm not going to put links to Amazon like some people. I mean, I'm tempted to, but no. I put the list. I put the bibliographic down there. If you want to, for those of you who really want to help me, and I immediately will get the money from it. Not immediately, but directly get the money from it. If you're studying Aristotle's Politics, you might want to look at my Lulu book, Notebook on Aristotle's Politics, because this, if you buy it through Lulu directly, I will get the money in that sense, because my other books, the publishers get the profit often, and they will wait and wait and wait. Where if you buy it even by Amazon, I'll make something every quarter or something like that. But if you buy the Lulu book on Amazon, okay, I'll make something every quarter, a little bit, But if you buy it directly from Lulu, and yes, you pay more for the shipping, I understand. But if you do that, I get the profit that Amazon and the bookstores get. So I make a little more money, significant, not a lot of money, but I get usually the 30% markup, that 20%, 30% markup that the publishers, the bookstores get. So that's it. 20%, 30%. I think that's right. So please help. I don't think if that's the way you can help me and do that. And that's it. That's it for the day. And we'll see each other next time we see this. We'll look at the concluding of book 1 and the wrapping up of justice, looking at book chapter 11. Take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.